Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. Just wait one second. All right. Thanks for coming today, everyone. I'm so happy to welcome back Anthony Sammarco, who is a very well-known author and historian, has written a number of novels about different events in Boston history. He was here last summer. You may have come when he did the Howard Johnson presentation, and today he's here to talk about the Baker Chocolate Company. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming on such a beautiful day. I think in a lot of ways, Baker chocolate is something that I think everyone here knows, but so didn't our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. Baker's chocolate is the oldest manufacturer in North America of chocolate, but it's not the chocolate that we eat. It's the chocolate we bake with. So baking chocolate, it's a little bit of a pun on the name of Baker's, is something that was actually produced as early as 1765, though it was actually known both in North and South America and in Europe as early as the period of the 16th century. Well, seen here on the cover of the book, there's a woman holding a Dorchester pottery bowl. She's about to frost a chocolate cake with chocolate fudge frosting. But you see at the top, which was actually a 1893 exhibition house, and down below the Pierce Mill that still stands in Dorchester Lower Mills, is a great example of this company that evolved for over 200 years in Dorchester. But the company in some ways actually produced a baking chocolate. But most of us know chocolate as a creamy, rich, delicious substance. Some of us can't refuse it, but seen here it would be made into everything from eating chocolate to chocolate mole, as well as even things that we would realize was not used for chocolate. But in a lot of ways, chocolate is something that was known in the Toltec and Aztec cultures. It had been cultivated as a cacao tree as early as the 13th century, and they would have ripenings twice annually. And the concept there was that there was a god of chocolate. Of course, I always thought chocolate was king, but this is the god of chocolate, and his name was Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl was somebody who was a fictional character, but somebody within the community would be honored to wear the mask, and actually it was a fertility rite. And twice annually, two different people would actually wear this mask, and the fertilization would take place of the cacao crop. This is now in the British Museum. But during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, it didn't change very much. But by the period of the conquistadors, who would actually go to South America, we realized that Montezuma, who was the emperor of the Aztecs, was somebody who had a very wonderful aspect. He had the recipe to make what he called chocolatl. Now, chocolatl differs from chocolate in the fact that it was a more bitter type of a chocolate, and it was flavored with vanilla and chili bean. So it was something that was reserved for royalty and the aristocracy and would be served hot and always in a hollowed-out coconut shell. Well, the conquistadors loved this chocolate recipe, and they actually gave a peace treaty, which meant nothing, for the exchange of a recipe for chocolatl. And what they did was to return to Europe and introduce it to Spain, where it would spread throughout Europe in that period, and was actually something that was part of the dowry of the granddaughter of the King of Spain when she married Louis XIV of France. That chocolate recipe for chocolatl would now have cream and sugar added to the cocoa that we know today. Well, during that period of time, in 1728, chocolatl was a drink of choice. And this is a print that was done in England in 1728, and it shows the three drinks of choice, other than water. On the left-hand side is a man from Arabia drinking a cup of coffee. In the center is a man from China drinking a cup of tea. And on the right is a Toltec warrior who's actually drinking a cup of chocolatl. And the chocolatl was, as I said, reserved for royalty and aristocracy, served in a hollowed-out coconut shell with gilt mounts as almost like a loving cup. So during that period, it was known, but it was not widely disseminated. But all chocolate derives from the Theobroma cacao tree. Now, seen here, it's a singular trunk tree with branches. It not only has large leaves that actually protect the beans because it's actually grown anywhere from 10 to 20 miles north or south of the equator around the world. But there are 24 different varieties of Theobroma cacao trees, and each one has a different flavor. Now, seen here, they didn't just grow from the branches, but cacao pods even grew from the trunk of the tree. Now, as I mentioned, they had been cultivated since about the 13th century. And the idea was that by the 19th century, and this is a botanical print, shows not just the cacao pod in the foreground, which is about 9 to 11 inches in length, 7 to 9 inches in circumference, but it would have these large leaves that evolved to protect it from the intensity of the sun. But the idea here was also that it would actually be gathered by everyone who lived in the community. After it had been fertilized in a ritual for 6 months, not only did they actually water it, cultivate it, but they would eventually even pick the pods. Now, seen here, people actually hold large spears, which at the very end have a hook. And of course, once the cacao pod had ripened, they would hit it with the hook, fall to the ground, and the people seen here in the foreground would actually gather them in wicker baskets. The photograph is from 1905, so it's something that you realized it hadn't changed for over 700 years. But the whole idea was, and this is a print of 1824, that the cacao pod on the left-hand side, when broken open, had cacao seeds. These seeds were about the size of one's thumbnail, and the idea here was that there were anywhere from 35 to 40 per pod. So it was a very interesting way that they had done this, and of course the leaves were readily edible because they gave a source of energy. And if you know cacao, it actually derived into cocaine. So in some ways, the Toltec and Aztec cultures had excessive energy. Well, here, they would actually dry the beans, and these two men are breaking open the pods, removing the seeds from the membrane, because the membrane was a very thick glutinous substance, and they place them onto pallets to air and sun dry. And because of the proximity of many of these plantations to the equator, they would dry within 2 to 3 weeks. Dried beans had shelf life, and in this instance, you could actually store them for 40 years without any adverse effect. But that whole concept was something that would be coming to Dorchester, Massachusetts. Seen here on a map of Dorchester on the top and Milton on the bottom of 1831, this was done by Edmund James Baker. He was a grandson of Dr. James Baker, who actually founded the Baker Chocolate Company, but he was a cartographer by trade. Now, the Neponset River, which would divide the two towns, was something that was known as the Neponset River. It was something that was actually named for the Neponset tribe of the Massachusetts Indians. But as early as 1634, the river was dammed for water power. The first grist mill in New England was opened in 1634, the first gunpowder factory in 1678, the first paper mill in 1728, and now the first chocolate mill in 1765. This area, which was primarily the industrial area of both Dorchester and Milton, had fewer than 150 people. Dorchester in 1831 only had 2,000 residents. Milton only had 900. But the idea here was that this man, Dr. James Baker, would actually start the chocolate mills. Well, Baker was educated locally in the Dorchester schools, and he was graduated from Harvard College in the class of 1760. And like most men at that time, he did study for the ministry for 2 years. He decided not to become a minister, and he kept school in Dorchester for a year. And by 1765, he had obtained the title of Doctor of Medicine. He never practiced, but he kept the name Dr. James Baker until the day he died. But in 1765, he was keeping a general store in Baker's Corners. Today we know it as Codman Square in Dorchester, but there he sold everything from staple goods to brooms, as well as, anything one would really need. And according to the history of Dorchester, he stumbled across a man by the name of John Hannon. John Hannon was a penniless Irish immigrant, according to the history, and he was found crying on the banks of the Neponset River. Actually, finding out what the problem was, the man had no money and no prospects, but he had the ability of making chocolate. And in that way, Dr. James Baker set him up in a small wooden mill on the Dorchester side of the Neponset River, where the first chocolate would be produced in North America. In the doorway was John Hannon, that penniless Irish immigrant, with Nathaniel Blake, who was his apprentice. And in the foreground, on the lower right-hand side, we see Dr. James Baker and his wife. Well, this mill was something that used water power. Unquity, or lower mills, had been dammed for water power as early as 1634. And in this instance, with dried cacao beans brought to Boston, they would then grind them into a pulverized aspect of glutinous chocolate and then produce what was basically baking chocolate. Now, baking chocolate is something that usually has an 80% cacao count or higher. During the period between 1765 and 1779, it wasn't known as baker's chocolate, it was known as Hannon's best chocolate. John Hannon had the skill, and of course Baker had the money, and he fronted the money to support the industry. But the surprising thing was, remember, in 1728, paper was first being produced on the river. A bar of chocolate, usually 8 ounces in size, would be wrapped in paper. And it was printed, as you see here, with the scales of justice, because it says at the bottom, if the chocolate does not prove good, the money will be returned. And in that instance, it's thought to be one of the first money-back guarantees on a food product in America. Well, during that period, Hannon did very well. He married a woman by the name of Elizabeth Gore of Roxbury. They had a son, and of course they lived a good life. But in 1779, he went to the West Indies to actually get additional cacao beans, but he never returned. And of course, the year later, the widow Hannon sold her half share of the business, and Dr. James Baker incorporated the House of Baker Chocolate. And in this instance, it would go for 3 generations. And seen here is his grandson, Walter Baker. Like his father Edmund and his grandfather Dr. James Baker, he too was graduated from Harvard College. This was in the class of 1818. But he did study law with Judge Tappan Reeves in Litchfield, Connecticut, so he was able to protect his family business not only as a purveyor of chocolate, but also as a legal entity. Well, Walter Baker was somebody, when he took over the business, there was only one mill making chocolate. And during the period of the 1820s and 30s, he was somebody in a lot of ways that would brand his business. His brand, or logo, was a young maiden that had a cornucopia, and it spewed forth the different types of chocolate that he made. They had premium chocolate, which was the highest cacao count. They would also have cocoa, and they had broma. Has anybody ever had chocolate broma? Have you ever had broma seltzer? Oh, you've eaten in my sister's house? Because we brought it with us. Chocolate broma was an effervescent drink, just like broma seltzer, but it was a chocolate flavor with iced water, and it was so refreshing in the summer months. And in the 19th century, it still can be had on Newbury Street, probably like $12 for a glass. But the idea is that broma was refreshing. Cocoa was served warm, and of course premium chocolate could be made into something delicious. Well, during this period, Walter Baker was advertising all of his different products, not just locally, but up and down the eastern seacoast. And seen here, Walter Baker and Company's broma, in the opinions of eminent physicians of Boston, is said to be a good food. Now, chocolate, I guess, can be a food, but this was signed by the eminent physicians of Boston, John Collins Warren, the first man to operate with anesthesia at the Massachusetts Hospital Dome. George Hayward, John Homans, Walter Channing, Zebdale Boylston Adams, and John Ware. They were well respected and eminent in their own right. They were also the same class at Harvard as Walter Baker. So during that period, he was utilizing not only his family operation and his skill, but he was also advertising what they made: chocolate, cocoa, broma, cocoa paste, and homeopathic chocolate. Sounds peculiar, but chocolate has more caffeine than coffee and tea combined. And in that instance, it could actually be cut down with simple things like chicory, or even such things as wheat that actually reduces the caffeine count. Well, these advertisements were incredible, and they actually were put wherever Baker chocolate was sold. But the whole idea was he died in 1852. His son, Walter Baker Jr., was living in London. His daughter, Florence Bridgham, was living in Paris. And the only person that showed any interest in the family business was his step-nephew, seen here. Henry Lilly Pierce had been born in Stoughton, Massachusetts. They moved to Dorchester Lower Mills, and he attended Milton Academy and later the Bridgewater Normal School. But by 1852, he was a counting clerk in his step-uncle's business, and he was very good at it. In 1854, he was allowed to take over the business, and for the next 30 years would be its president, but he would not be allowed to buy it until 1884. Well, during that period of time, he inherited the old stone mill seen on the far left-hand side. This had been built in 1849 after the original mill had been destroyed by fire. This was built of granite. It was designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant, who designed not just the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, but also the Charles Street Jail. And it was something thought to be impervious to fire because the floors were metal as well, and metal shutters. So during the period between 1854 and his death in 1896, Henry Pierce would actually change the campus of Baker Chocolate. One of the first buildings he would have constructed is in the center distance, the Pierce Mill, and he would hire probably one of the most prominent architects in all of Boston. In that instance, Nathaniel Bradley was an architect who could choose his clients. Has anybody ever been to the South End and you see the row houses? They're red bricks, swell bay facade. They share a uniformity of height, setback, building material. Well, Nathaniel Bradley created what he called the Boston Row House. And during the period of the 1850s and 60s, we saw not just the South End, but Bay Village built up as a new neighborhood on filled land. Well, by the 1870s, Nathaniel Bradley could write his own ticket. He was wealthy in his own right, but he was a very successful architect. And during the period, he and his successors of Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall would design 11 of the 12 extant buildings in the complex. The Pierce Mill that I mentioned was something that was a precursor to the urbane district of what became Dorchester. Dorchester in the period of 1870 was going through the throes of annexation. Many people in Dorchester wanted to annex to the city of Boston, and the whole aspect was there were only 8,000 residents, but over 6,000 of them were new residents. They, of course, had land. And when an acre of land was worth $100, in 1871, the year after annexation, that acre was worth $1,000. And $1,000 doesn't sound like a tremendous amount of money, but at that time it would be the equivalent today of close to $100,000. He built the Pierce Mill, completed in 1872. It was 5 stories in height, a second French Empire mill where not only chocolate was produced, but where it would be wrapped by women as wrappers, as well as actually women who filled tins of cocoa. This was a trade card, and you can see in the 4 corners gold and silver medals. Between 1854 and 1896, Henry Pierce was actually entering his chocolate in not just local competitions, but even in worldwide competitions, and his chocolate received gold medals, silver as well as bronze. And during this period of time, you had to realize that the lower mills, which is a very small area, once had 4 chocolate manufacturers. It's a child's dream. And during that period, they had Preston's chocolate mill. And of course, Preston was a brother-in-law of Walter Baker. You can imagine Thanksgiving dinners in that family. There was Dr. Ware's chocolate from 1840, with a man who ascribed to the Broma. And then there was Webb and Twombly that was on the Milton side of the river. By 1881, Henry Pierce had bought out his former competitors. And the surprising thing is, when he built a new mill, he would name it after his former competitor. And seen here is the Webb Mill at the corner of Elliott and Adams Street on the Milton side of the Neponset River. And in this instance, this area became more urbane, more built up than any other part of Dorchester, including Milton. But during the period of the 19th century, chocolate was king. And it was also a large employer. By the period of World War I, Baker's Chocolate was the second largest employer on the South Shore of Massachusetts. The first was Fore River Shipyard. And seen here, they also had 60% of their workforce as women. Women would work as chocolate wrappers, cocoa tin fillers, secretaries, stenographers, or even the trademark come to life, and we would see them dress as La Belle Chocolatiere. But this is a print from 1900. It shows the women at the noon hour. They actually would work from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., 5 days a week, and a half day on Saturdays. But they would have an hour break for lunch. And of course, many people walked to work so they could walk home for a very warm lunch. But they could go to a area restaurant or a lunch stand. But during that period, you realize that this area, known as Pierce Square since 1892, would be the junction of Dorchester Avenue, Washington Street, and Adams Street. It was a major thoroughfare and a major connector from the South Shore to Boston. The pink buildings are red brick. Each one of them were designed by Nathaniel Bradley or Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall. The yellow buildings were built of wood. So by this period, this was one of the most densely built-up areas by the turn of the 20th century. And we realized they were making many of the same things they had made in the 1840s and 1850s. Well, these are trade cards that were done probably around 1895. This was premium #1 chocolate. This was the 80% cacao count, and it was a bar of chocolate, 8 ounces in size, wrapped in blue paper with a cream label, and it was something that you knew was not going to differ one iota from the one you might have bought a month previously. So during this period, they were buying, in some ways, cacao beans that could be combined in a different way to create a specific chocolate, including German sweet chocolate. Well, Samuel German was English, not German. He came to this country as Walter Baker's coachman, but in 1840 he wanted a job in the factory. And it was his brilliant idea to add sugar to the molten chocolate. So when it was poured into an 8-ounce mold, this was the first readily edible chocolate that they made. And they called it German sweet chocolate. So impressed was Walter Baker that he gave him a $1,000 bonus. Now, in 1841, $1,000 was a tremendous amount of money, but I think also naming it after him was an even greater honor. So they had premium #1, German sweet chocolate, and vanilla chocolate. Does anybody like white chocolate? I love it myself, but some people don't really like it. But there's no chocolate in it whatsoever. It's made with cacao butter, the butter fat, flour, and vanilla flavoring. My mother used to say it was the most fattening chocolate you could eat, as it was all over my face. But in this instance, you could either have it as a small bonbon on your plate, or you could make it into vanilla cocoa. And it said that the smoothness, delicacy, and flavor, it was good to eat and good to drink, and always ask for Walter Baker and Company's vanilla chocolate. In that instance, there was a variety, and there was also Caracas sweet chocolate. This didn't differ at all from what was premium #1. The only difference was that the beans came from Caracas, Venezuela. And in that way, you would see the 24 different varieties of each of these individual chocolates being made, and it was consistent. because as early as 1834, Walter Baker hired a woman who would actually keep the trade secrets of what the recipes were for each of the individual chocolates. By 1900, there were 21 varieties. Her name was Martha Pond, and she lived locally. And the surprising thing was the reason she could keep a secret was because she was a deaf mute. A woman who would not have been employable anywhere else was somebody who was an integral part of the Walter Baker Company division. Well, in that way, the biggest sale, though, was breakfast cocoa. And a cup of cocoa was said to be not only delicious, but nutritious. And seen here in a half-pound can, it talks about Belle Chocolatiere, and we'll discuss her in a few moments. But breakfast cocoa was touted as a great breakfast, or an afternoon snack, or even before bedtime. So during this period, Walter Baker was doing quite well. They also had a very large staff. By the turn of the 20th century, there were over 1,100 people working in the mills. This is the packing room, and this was in the basement of the Pierce Mill. And this would actually look out onto the Neponset River, because once beans had come to Boston on ships, they'd be floated out by barge to Dorchester and unloaded at the packing room. Now remember, they're dried beans. They had shelf life. You could hold them for 20, 30, 40 years. And these men are actually stenciling country of origin as well as the date. And once they began to make chocolate, Henry Pierce had bought rotisseries in Germany in the 1880s. These were a great impression. And not only did they replace the grist mills, but they were something that were hygienic. Along the top was a conveyor belt. The beans would come down into a rotisserie. The beans would be roasted and brought down to a fulling machine. And the fulling machine would actually remove the shells of the cacao bean. In that instance, it actually removed much of the work. And we see in some instances that the chocolate on the left-hand side would arrive at this drying room as slabs of chocolate. But there was a 50% cacao count, but there was also a 50% cocoa butter count. And you wanted to remove the cocoa butter. In the 18th century, it was used for a variety of purposes, including, greasing axles or wagon wheels, later sold to the cosmetic industry. But if you see on the right-hand side, the man on the far right, he's in front of a conching machine. These bars of chocolate would be allowed to air and sun-dry. They'd be placed into the conching machine, which was a wire basket, and they'd be tumbled 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. At that point, it would actually separate between chocolate and the cocoa butter. And in that way, they could then make whatever chocolate they were going to make. Well, after the chocolate was made, they'd be brought to the women in the wrapping stations. And again, this is the Pierce Mill in 1900. The woman in the foreground would be brought bars of raw chocolate. She'd wrap them in white paper and then in a label. She'd place them into a box, and then they'd be taken to the shipping and receiving dock. And here was actually the cocoa wrapping station. Each of these women would be actually putting cocoa into the tins, sealing them, and again, placing them into the wooden boxes to be brought to shipping and receiving. Once this was done, it would then be brought to the dock. And the dock was adjacent, as you can see here, to many of the mills, but it was here that they might be distributed locally by a horse-drawn wagon. These tarpaulins were covered in oilcloth. Remember, chocolate melts, not only in your hand, but in your car. In this way, this was something that allowed a little bit of leeway, except for the months of July and August when it wasn't produced. But if it was to be shipped, you might notice on the left-hand side, railroad cars. And this was a branch of the Dorchester and Milton branch of the Old Colony Railroad. There was a branch that connected downtown Boston to Mattapan. But this was a branch that would bring the chocolate into Neelan Street and then to either North Station or South Station or even a ship in the harbor. And chocolate was shipped not only as far north as Canada, but even as far south as South America. And in many ways, people began to realize in the mid-19th century, this is a broadside that's actually 4 feet by 2.5 feet, that Walter Baker's, one of many chocolate manufacturers in the country by the mid-century, was making American and vanilla chocolates, prepared cocoa, broma, and homeopathic cocoa. But I date this to 1850 because on the right-hand side is a frontiersman, probably from the gold rush of 1849. On the left, of course, we see a person from a Toltec or Aztec country. But in this instance, these advertisements, which today bring tremendous amounts of money, are a great way to see the marketing and advertising of Baker's chocolate. And by the period of the 1870s, Baker Chocolate was making receipt books. These are recipe books, but the receipt aspect was something that their great-grandmothers would have used in the 18th century. Seen here, this is the cover from 1876, the 100th anniversary of the United States. Not only was it 100 pages in length, but it was beautifully illustrated. And the cover, as you can see here, has gold coins in the 4 corners. And one of them says that they had won this gold coin at the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations in New York in 1853. But they came from Paris, London, Switzerland, and Germany. But these recipe books were things that if you followed the recipe and melted the chocolate properly, you could make things such as simple fudge, or you could make Charlotte Russe to impress family and friends. These were beautiful cookbooks and given away free for the asking. In many ways, Henry Pierce would actually replace the logo with one of his own. I'm sure everyone recognizes La Belle Chocolatiere. She was probably one of the better-known food logos in the United States. Her real name was Anna Baltouf, and her father was Melchior, who was a knight of the Austrian court. They were impoverished, and she was working in a chocolate shop when she caught the eye of a young man. Well, it turned out that that young man who she was serving a cup of cocoa and a glass of water to was Prince Denrickson, the nephew of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Very fortuitous. And in that instance, he had her portrait painted when he married her, and it hung in their palace in Germany until 1825 when she died. Today it's in the Gallery Alte Meister, the Royal Portrait Collection in Dresden. But that instance was, by 1881, Henry Pierce had now incorporated this from Das Chocolatenmaiden, as it was known, now to La Belle Chocolatiere, the logo of the largest chocolate company in America. And in some ways, they would actually do these wonderful cocoa sets. And if you collected coupons from the bars of chocolate wrapping as well as from the cocoa tins, you could get something such as Shelley Bone China, Lamonge from France, or Dresden from Germany. I bought this at Skinner Auction. I haven't seen it since I bought it. It's in the basement. But I bought it because it was such a beautiful piece and indicative because you see La Belle Chocolatiere. Can you imagine getting these actually because you've collected coupons? It sounds like things years ago. Do you remember Duz? You'd actually buy Duz detergent and you basically get a free glass. This is Dresden, China. And in many ways, if it was said to be the best chocolate in the world, what better way than to stir it with a silver spoon? These were made by Oneida Silversmiths in upstate New York. This is silver plate. Silver plate was given away free of charge. But if you wanted a sterling spoon, it was 10 cents. And you can see, La Belle, I know, give me a dozen. But seen here at the top is La Belle Chocolatiere in profile. That marketing technique is something that not only allowed you to collect a cocoa service, but also silverware. And it was important. But in the 1840s and 50s, the company had actually done the exhibitions at the Marshfield Fair, the Brockton Fair, the Topsfield Fair. But by the 1850s and 60s, they were actually doing European exhibitions. Well, seen here was the Chicago exhibition of 1893. And the pavilion, as they called it, which was something that would have only be used for 9 months and then demolished, was something that Walter Baker wanted to do so that they could actually toot and market their chocolate. They hired Carey and Hastings, probably the best-known architectural firm in New York. This building costs $90,000 at that time for 9 months. The building had 2 staircases of white marble ascending to a large exhibition hall, probably twice the size of this room. And when one entered into it, you would see displays of Baker's chocolate. They'd have bars of chocolate, tins of cocoa, and apothecary jars that would be filled with readily edible chocolate bonbons. Remember, they're made from the recipe books. But it was also a place that would actually have people doing chocolate cakes, brownies, and fudge. And we would see women who were called demonstrators, La Belle Chocolatiere come to life, making a chocolate cake with fudge frosting. It looked good. I'm sure we'd salivate over it. But when they cut it and you were invited to taste it, it was incredible because everything that was served was actually free of charge. So whether it was cocoa or broma, chocolate cake, fudge, cookies, bonbons, it was incredible. And in the 4 corners of this pavilion were desks, and on the desk was a color postcard of La Belle Chocolatiere pre-stamped. And you could write home to family and friends, I just had Baker's chocolate. You too should. So everybody in the country began to realize that these exhibitions, which often brought close to 400,000 to 500,000 people, that Baker's was a good purveyor of chocolate. Well, in that instance, they made wonderful things such as this serving tray. And you see La Belle Chocolatiere, but in the base, it has a small wooden house. Well, this is the 1907 Jamestown, Virginia exhibition house designed by Edwin Lewis, a well-known Dorchester and Milton architect, that was used for 9 months, but they actually made it into a residence and still stands. But there was also an exhibition house in San Francisco in 1915. Well, I'd go just to go into this building, but look at the top, a minaret with cocoa and white light bulbs. Look at the women at the doorway, and then look at the 2 pavilions on either side with elephant heads. I mean, it's attractive, but once you got inside and you realized that everything was free of charge, it was a great attraction. So these exhibitions didn't just show industry throughout the United States, but it would also in some instances include many food purveyors, and bakers became extremely well known. Well, in some instances, they continued to go to the Brockton, Topsfield, and even Marshfield Fair. This was actually in the Marshfield Fair in 1907. It says Walter Baker and Company, Dorchester, cocoa and chocolate. The women are dressed as La Belle Chocolatiere and the young men in suits, but they serve everything from cocoa and broma as well as a variety of sweets. These were important because bakers had women and men from the age of 14 or 15 all the way into their 80s. These 3 young girls are probably no more than 16 years of age, and they worked in the factory. The woman in the center holds a tin of cocoa. The woman on the left, the tray that I just showed you, and on the right, she's holding a Shelley china bone cup and saucer that has La Belle Chocolatiere in profile. These were important features because demonstrators who would go out to greet the public always had to have a smile, and they had to look just like the chocolate trademark come to life. In some ways, they would give away choice receipts. And the recipe books themselves, and this is from 1917, is a good example not only of La Belle Chocolatiere as the profile of the logo, but look at the edging. This is like this wonderful weave work of not only the cacao pod, cacao leaves, but the cacao flowers, something that was quite exotic. And anybody from Dorchester would have said, you know, I know cacao, but what did it look like? And in this way, you might make things such as Wellesley fudge, Radcliffe fudge, Smith fudge, Mount Holyoke fudge, Bryn Mawr fudge, or even Vassar fudge. But each of these books didn't just have recipes. They also had articles on the nutritional value of chocolate. And this is a woman who would write for many years. Has anybody ever heard of Ellen Swallow Richards? Well, this woman was really a marvel in her day. She was graduated from Vassar in 1878. and she decided to apply to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which was all male, to get a master's that was actually in chemistry and biology. People laughed at her, but she was determined, and she was admitted as a special student. And during that period of time, not only did she study, but she was also graduate at the top of her class. She would later marry Professor Richards, the man who actually encouraged her. But during the period, because she was a very wealthy woman, she became known as the soup kitchen woman. She would found soup kitchens in Boston's North End, South End, and West End, and she would train immigrant women to make highly nutritious soups and stews and breads that could then be sold at very reasonable prices to people coming home in the evening from the factory. And during that period, she funded it out of her own purse. So during that period, she was a very well-respected woman. Well, Henry Pierce knew her, and he asked her to write about the nutritional value of chocolate. We've all heard that a piece of chocolate and a sip of red wine is wonderful. What about an 8-ounce bar of chocolate? But she is somebody as a wonderful feature of the company, and she was one of many people that did this. But during the period of the turn of the 20th century, Baker's Chocolate was one of dozens of manufacturers of chocolate. If you think about it, Hershey's, Nestle's, Mars, it went the gamut. They decided to do a calendar in 1900, and they decided that every 20 years would represent a generation, which is feasible, unless you're a Mitchell, my family. My grandfather was 51 when my mother was born. My mother was 41 when I was born. It's not quite as skewed. But in this instance, they would do it for every 6 generations. Well, in 1780, the first generation, my lady drinks her first cup of Baker's cocoa. It says that the house of Walter Baker and Company is known and was founded in the year 1780 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And a woman of the young republic drinks her cocoa from an export porcelain cup and saucer. Martha Washington is a portrait on the wall, and a King Charles Spaniel looks out at us. Well, 20 years later, or the next generation, the fame of Baker's cocoa grows with that of the young republic. And these sayings are quite interesting. Pure cocoa acts as a gentle stimulant and invigorates and corrects the action of digestive organs. Not only did it taste good, but it was good for you. 20 years later, the third generation, to speed the parting guest. Walter Baker and Company's cocoa is known and served in every hostelry or inn. On a journey, you cannot take any refreshment so wholesome, sustaining, and delicious. And in 1840, doctors now recommend Baker's chocolate as a beneficent restorer of exhaustive power. Get this. I know it sounds good. A perfect food. Preserves health, prolongs life, and soothes both stomach and brain. We should all have a piece of chocolate tonight. And in 1860, it's the fashion to take a cup of Baker's chocolate after a constitutional. And it says that the people who make constant use of chocolate are the ones who enjoy the most steady health and are the least subject to a multitude of little ailments which destroy the comfort of life. And in 1880, La Belle Chocolatiere now enters millions of homes as the trademark of the finest chocolate and cocoa in the world. And it says that a booklet of choice recipes by Miss Perola and other noted teachers will be sent free on application to Walter Baker. So not only was it free, but it was something that you could actually replicate these things at home for family and friends. But the 6th generation descendant wasn't going to keep her hourglass figure much longer if she drank cocoa and ate chocolate every day. But seen on the upper left, I know, isn't it cute? On the upper left-hand side is La Belle Chocolatiere, and here the Gibson girl of 1900. This was the most important feature. There were many companies making chocolate, but no one could date them back to 1780. And Walter Baker and Company was something that had been really created, not just by the Baker family, but by Henry Pierce. Remember, Henry Pierce had actually taken over the reins in 1854. He was allowed to buy the company from the Baker trustees in 1884, And he would continue to serve not just as president, but he also was mayor of Boston in 1873 and 1877. He was not only a local congressman, but he was a United States congressman. He traveled to Europe every summer. Remember, they closed in July and August. You really couldn't produce chocolate. And during those months, it wasn't for vacation. He inspected the manufacturing of chocolate in both England, France, Germany, Switzerland, as well as even Russia. And in that instance, this portrait done by Bonnet in Paris in 1893 showed him as a grand gentleman. When he died in 1896, he left $71 million. Today, it would be the equivalent of about $3 billion. He left $1 million each to Harvard, MIT, Associated Charities, which was a non-sectarian group, the Homeopathic Hospital, which is today the BU Medical Center, and the Museum of Fine Arts. Each of his nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews would each get a trust of $50,000. But to every employee in his employ over 1 year at the time of his death would receive $1,000 for every year of service. The average ratio was 40 years of service. This allowed people not only to buy a house, but to educate their children. And of course, he realized without his employees, his company would never have been the success it was. The next year, in 1897, the company was sold to the Forbes Syndicate, headed by J. Murray Forbes. He lived in the Back Bay as well as Milton Hill. Today, his house is the Captain Robert Bennett Forbes House Museum. And what they did was to continue the production of chocolate, but also increase advertising. There were magazines such as the Youth's Companion, Collier's, the St. Nicholas magazine, and each of them would have full-page color advertisements. And of course, this young child, it says, her favorite doll. Well, she's blonde and blue-eyed. It says, now I have my dolly, pretty soon I'll have my cocoa. Of course, if she was my granddaughter, I'd only serve her Baker's cocoa as well. So children love Baker's chocolate. And even when a sister arrives at her brother's fraternity house, she doesn't find them drinking beer. She sets up a cocoa table. And it becomes the center of attraction, a perfect food. And of course, everyone looks at her quizzically as she sits at an improvised cocoa table pouring a cup of cocoa. And of course, it was also during World War I, the doughboys in France weren't drinking wine. Somewhere the boys are drinking a baker's cocoa toast to mothers, fathers, wives, or sweethearts. Delicious of dreams of home. So you realize in that instance they're touching upon every aspect of American society. And of course, even theater actresses, which were a little removed from polite society in 1907, it says that there's nothing so soothing, refreshing, and delicious after a strenuous night on the stage as a cup of baker's cocoa. I think a martini might be quite good. But in this instance, you see their friends on the Presidium and they're enjoying cocoa at a cocoa table. Well, in some instances, it wasn't just theater actresses, doughboys in France, young college men and children. They even made Little Red Riding Hood, approaching grandmother's house with a compliment of a basket of Christmas dainties of cocoa and chocolate. Now they were even using fairy tales. Many of these advertisements were done by a man named Norman Price. He's unknown today, but he was a mentor of Norman Rockwell, and he did these as paintings that would then be transferred to wonderful graphics for worldwide magazines. Many people realize that Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall had done most of the various buildings, but in 1919 they actually hired Stearns and Bigelow to design the administration building. This was actually where the president's office was located, as well as all the secretarial aspect, and a museum on Baker's chocolate. And at the top, you can see a neon sign, which has just been restored, beautifully illuminated at night. But the whole aspect was, each of these buildings would actually represent the best mill village in and around Boston. and chocolate was big business. Seen here at the administration building at the top of the stairs was a 6-foot-tall portrait of La Belle Chocolatiere done by Norman Price. And seen in the foreground were demonstrators. Many of these women would go out to women's clubs, senior centers, various things dressed as La Belle Chocolatiere come to life, and they'd serve cocoa and cookies and candy and all sorts of different things. It was said that anyone who was a valued client would be greeted by these women at the top of the stairs, but so too weren't Boy Scouts and Girl Scout troops. They could come any time they wanted, and it seemed like anybody within walking distance might come 5 or 6 times a year because they could have as much cocoa and chocolate as they liked. They couldn't take it home, though. But in that instance, it was a major feature, and seen here, the building has been converted into an artist's loft. It has over 40 individual studios where people can live and paint. But La Belle Chocolatiere by Norman Price has been beautifully restored. Now, during that period, the Forbes Syndicate had done well. They increased the company tenfold. But they sold it in 1927 to Postum Corporation. Postum is known as General Foods. And seen here from a hot air balloon, you can see in the very center the administration building. But look how densely built up this was by the first part of the 1920s. This was a major feature with the river going through the complex. Well, General Foods would rename this the Baker Division of General Foods. And during that period of time, on the left-hand side, which had been the type of things they had made for over 100 years, tins of cocoa, bars of chocolate. At the top is even Baker's Dot chocolate. Dot is diminutive for Dorchester. I hate it. But on the right-hand side, they began to make Baker's milk chocolate, the first readily edible milk chocolate bar. It had been introduced by Hershey's, and Hershey's, of course, hired 2 chocolate makers for Baker's. You'd also see here at the bottom, which was actually, as I look at it, my eyesight is gone, Baker's Caracas sweet chocolate and bran chocolate. But you see the 2 little things at the top that look like cigarette cases? These were called sweet chocolate tablets, and they were circular discs of chocolate covered in candy. They're not M&Ms, but they could have been M&Ms. And today we might have been eating sweet chocolate tablets, except M&Ms in our hand. This became something that was a major feature. And of course, remember, Postum or General Foods did brands and cereals, and they would combine them to make wonderful, readily edible chocolate. But they also did advertisement, and this is something that would appear in Look and Life magazine. And they would actually have a woman that says, "My niece Mabel was all of a dither. Now why can't I make chocolate cake like that?" she wailed. Well, the poor thing. Of course, you see on the right-hand side, this is a butterscotch chocolate pecan cake. Looks delicious, but the recipe was there as well. These were things that allowed people across the country to make something that impressed family and friends. But they also would make Wellesley fudge cake. Remember, they'd been making Wellesley fudge since the 1870s, but now this is made with real Baker's chocolate, and it's a taste you never outgrow. Not only was it a dense, rich chocolate with buttermilk, but it had the Wellesley fudge made into a frosting. Send me a piece. They also have a cake that was made with Baker's cocoa. And you realize that Baker's cocoa is richer, darker, and better for baking. And in this instance, not only could you make a cake, and this is a milk chocolate frosting, but down below, divinity fudge, made with marshmallows as well as rich chocolate. Each of these things was seen by thousands, if not millions of people. And in that way, Baker's chocolate became extremely well known. By the 1840s, General Foods continued to expand. And one of the aspects was that they began to make chocolate chips. Now, chips can come basically as miniature or larger, like a Hershey's Kiss. But in this instance, this man is calibrating the size of the chocolate chip to be made. Now, look at that. Thousands of them are made every day, and it was really quite a profitable way of doing it. It wasn't done by hand. But we would also see people realizing they could make 25-pound bars of chocolate. Now these, of course, they look fantastic, and I'd say it would last until Monday morning, but the idea here was these were sold to the confectionery trade, and people would melt it and make hand-dipped bonbons. Well, during the period, it was also the fact that they would actually have cocoa tins that were now cardboard. And they actually had conveyor belts, just like the conveyor belts for the chocolate chips. The women wear rayon drip-dry uniforms, and as you can see, it kind of looks like La Belle Chocolatiere. But this was a major feature because now they could not only increase production at less effort, but they could also be recognized. And seen here was a woman, Gloria Redman, who was actually a woman who filled cocoa tins faster than anyone else in the history of Baker's chocolate. And she's showing Curtis Geiger, who was the president of the Baker division of General Foods, how she filled those cocoa tins. Well, not only did she receive a week's salary, but she received a week's vacation. And it was a nice way to recognize her. She was somebody who had worked there at that point for like 27 years. But Curtis Geiger on the right-hand side wasn't just the president. He was a graduate of Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and though he was president of the company, he was also the man who invented the chocolate bab. Have you ever bought a bar of chocolate and it's broken into 8 one-ounce pieces? That's called a bab. You break it off, 3 squares, melt it in the microwave, and combine it with other ingredients, you have something that's readily made that actually is pre-measured for you. So whether it was his chocolate bab or her filling cocoa tins faster than anyone else, the two of them were integral parts of Baker's. So like Henry Pierce recognizing his employees, everyone was contributing to the effort. Well, during the period of the late 50s, early 60s, they were now making Baker's 4-in-1. The 4-in-1 was instant cocoa mix. I hated it as a child. I would always ask, can't you make it from scratch like we always did? But you could mix it with hot or cold, milk or water, but in that instance, you had a quick cup of cocoa. But during that period, they were also looking at this to say to people, imagine this gorgeous 4-layer cake, so inexpensive. It's the baker's chocolate that makes it taste so luxuriously rich. So it's a 4-layer cake of white and chocolate, but also a rich milk chocolate frosting. And if you look at the lower right-hand side, those are what chocolate babs look like. And in that way, they were stamped with La Belle Chocolatiere, the logo, and you would actually have 8 babs in an 8-ounce box of chocolate. Great marketing. But one of the biggest things that they did was in 1957, and Baker's offered a worldwide competition for $1,000. And it said, to anyone who submitted a recipe that used not only General Foods shredded coconut, chopped pecans, and Baker's chocolate, they would actually be awarded the prize. Well, a woman from Dallas, Texas, would actually create what she called German sweet chocolate cake. And this was something that was not only delicious, but it became the type of thing that it was served in almost every restaurant throughout the United States. She herself would actually, in some ways, with $1,000, which in 1957 was about a third the price of a house, receive it and great recognition. I go into great detail. But in a lot of ways, by the period of the 1960s, the company was actually experiencing changes. They couldn't expand. They were on the river or on the sidewalk. They couldn't actually build up. So they decided to move to Dover, Delaware. And Dover, Delaware had lower taxes. It also could have a modern building that was temperature controlled so that chocolate could be made 12 months out of the year. And they offered to any employee who would go 2 years of salary. During that period, by 1966, everything except the Dream Whip division was gone. That survived until 1969. And much of the buildings were used by the local welfare office, Mark Bell Furniture, Papa Bear Tours, who always did my travel. But I think in a lot of ways what happened was that these buildings were relegated to something that could be demolished. And what really happened was that by the early part of the 1980s, there was great conversation to create a national park. And of course, what better way than to do it here with the history of chocolate? By 1991, this would open as one of the biggest repurposings in the city of Boston. What had once been, during World War I and World War II and the Korean conflict, the largest employers, 3,600 by World War II, was now repurposed for living space. They had luxury condominiums, luxury apartments, medium-priced condos and apartments, handicapped accessible, as well as artist lofts. And during that period, where 3,600 people had once worked, now was the home of over 900 people. On the left-hand side is the Adams Mill, built in 1905, the Pierce Mill, built in 1872, and a great example of this repurposing was that it added to this overlay of lower mills and spurred on, in some ways, restaurants and bars and coffee shops that today represent, in some ways, a great transformation of an area that had seen changes in the 1960s because of Baker's moving to Dover, Delaware. Well, the history of Baker's Chocolate Company is not just a wonderful amalgamation of stories that talk about the history of chocolate, but it's also the oldest manufactured chocolate in America. Today, it's owned by Kraft Family Foods. It's one of 83 different types of food under the Kraft name. But I think of it sometimes as a delicious memory from the past. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Don't forget about the smell.
Well, the idea of the aroma was something you could not only imagine it, but could you imagine in 1860 when there were 4 manufacturers of chocolate? It was called Chocolate Village. I mean, I could go on for hours on this. You want to stay? I mean, I'll talk. But I think sometimes it really was a major employer, but the major producer. Yes?
Just one of my favorite memories from childhood was the school trip to the Baker Chocolate.
Really? Not only did they bring in school children, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, brownies, I love that, but also Cub Scouts. But the funny thing was, every single mill that made chocolate had a wooden barrel outside. And many times a bar of chocolate would break. And they'd put them in the barrel and you could help yourself. Can you imagine kind of like a person drinking muscadel and lying in the gutter? You could see people in the gutter with chocolate all over their faces. Any other questions or comments? Very much so. Medway Street, just behind it. Oh, yes, it's a fantastic area. And a lot of it's been restored in a way that I did a walking tour last week for residents of the Baker Chocolate Mills. And it was lovely. It was nice to see everything, and also the sign that was illuminated again. It was never lit during my lifetime. But I think sometimes you realize how important an industry this really was.
As a kid, in all the crowd, would go and find some of these big slabs of chocolate, and they'd come out and throw them up in the air when they broke.
Well, I did that to a holy Station of the Cross to use the chalk on the ground. I think I walked about a year later. Anyway. They don't. And that's the funny thing. Even on Amazon.com, the question was about chocolate broma. But there is a cafe on Newbury Street, and they actually serve chocolate broma. It's so wonderful. But the idea is, in some ways, we think of broma as something that's a corrective thing for our digestive organs. But in that instance, it was something that was really refreshing. So I think, you look at bakers and you begin to realize in some ways, this is something that probably many of us realize somebody in our family or somebody we knew worked at Baker's Chocolate. If you lived in that area, by the turn of the 20th century, many people were taking the streetcar from Savin Hill, or they were taking the streetcar from Quincy. And I think in that instance, as a major employer, they were making a very marketable product, but they were also basically, as I said, very kind. I'll say one last thing. During the 1920s, they instituted vacation time, maternity leave, as well as a modified, what we would think of, 401k plan. Every person would receive a coupon, 5 coupons for every year of service. And then you'd get a catalog. Do you remember Spiegel's catalog? And you could actually choose from that something. So if you had 5 coupons, maybe you could get a dinner bell or a wicker hamper. Say you were there for 40 years and you had 200 coupons, it might be a sterling silver dinnerware service for a dozen. So these were things in a lot of ways the company gave to people. They were small incentives, but a lot of companies weren't doing that in the 1920s. So it's a fun aspect, and I really enjoyed it. One last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Was Baker one of the first to have women workers?
One of the first to have women workers. Now, there were women in a smaller capacity in the fish industry as well as the grain industry and things of that sort. But I think this was the first time that not only they had a deaf-mute woman who was taken very seriously, but they also had 2 women known as Mary and Christina Shields, 2 sisters who wrapped chocolate in the 1850s. By the period of the 1870s, it moved up to 60% women. And you know, the thing is, a lot of times it wasn't married women so much, it was women who were unmarried or people that had been widowed and had to go back to work. And you can imagine what a wonderful place to work. Of course, it smelt wonderful, but it was also the fact that they had the benefits. And I think Henry Pierce surprised everyone, including his family, when he left $1,000 for every year of service. So it's incredible. Thank you all for coming.